Jerry Schilling was not famous when he met Elvis Presley. He was not a musician, not a manager, and not someone looking for a way into the entertainment business. He was a teenager growing up in Memphis, Tennessee in the 1950s, living the same kind of ordinary life that most young people in that city lived at the time. He went to school, spent time with friends, and played football in the neighborhood like many other kids his age. Nothing about his early life pointed toward the idea that he would one day become one of the closest friends of the most famous entertainer in the world. The story of how Jerry met Elvis is one that Jerry himself has told many times over the years, and it is worth telling again because it sets the foundation for everything that came after. In 1954, Jerry was around 11 or 12 years old when he ended up in a football game in North Memphis that included an older teenager named Elvis Presley. Elvis was around 19 at the time and had not yet released a single record. He was just a young man from the same city, playing football with a group of kids in the neighborhood. There was nothing about that afternoon that would have told anyone present that this particular young man was about to change American music forever. What Jerry remembered from that day was not anything dramatic. Elvis was friendly, easy to be around, and treated the younger kids in the game with the same respect he gave everyone else. That quality, the ability to make people feel comfortable regardless of who they were, stayed consistent in Elvis throughout his entire life, and it was something Jerry noticed even in that first meeting. It made an impression that stayed with him. The two did not immediately become close friends after that football game. They moved in overlapping circles in Memphis, and their paths crossed again in the years that followed. By the time Elvis had become a recording artist and was beginning to build the group of friends and associates who would eventually be known as the Memphis Mafia, Jerry was a young man in his late teens who had stayed connected to Elvis through those shared Memphis roots. Jerry officially became part of Elvis's inner circle in 1964. By that point, Elvis was one of the most recognized people on the planet. He had already recorded dozens of songs, appeared in multiple films, and performed for audiences across the country. The world around Elvis had changed completely from the days of those neighborhood football games. But Elvis himself still valued the people who had known him before all of that happened. Jerry was one of those people, and that mattered to Elvis. What made Jerry different from many others in Elvis's circle was the path his own life took. Many of the men around Elvis stayed close to Graceland and built their lives around their connection to him. Jerry took a different direction. He pursued his own career in the entertainment industry, eventually working as a film editor and later as a manager for artists including the Beach Boys and Billy Joel. He built something of his own, separate from Elvis, which required him to step back from the day-to-day life at Graceland for stretches of time. Elvis respected that. According to Jerry, Elvis was genuinely interested in what Jerry was doing with his own life and career. He did not see Jerry's independence as a rejection or a sign of disloyalty. If anything, it seemed to strengthen the bond between them. Elvis was surrounded by people who depended on him entirely, and Jerry was one of the few people in his life who did not. This is an important detail when thinking about the phone calls between them. When Elvis called Jerry, it was not to give an instruction or make a request. It was to talk, to connect with someone who knew him as a person rather than as a star. Jerry has described Elvis as someone who could be completely himself in those conversations, in a way that was harder for him to achieve with people inside the Graceland circle. Jerry Schilling eventually wrote about his friendship with Elvis in a memoir titled Me and a Guy Named Elvis, published in 2006. The book covers decades of friendship, travel, conversations, and shared experiences. It is written from the perspective of someone who genuinely cared about Elvis, and who spent years after his death thinking about what their friendship meant. The story of their final phone call is part of that larger story. To understand what Elvis said and why it still stays with Jerry today, it helps to understand how that friendship was built in the first place. Not every friendship survives fame. When one person becomes known by the entire world and the other remains a private individual living a normal life, the distance between them can grow until there is nothing left to hold the relationship together. That did not happen with Elvis Presley and Jerry Schilling. Their friendship lasted from the mid-1950s until the day Elvis died in August 1977, and it did so because both men put something real into it over the years. To understand how their friendship worked, it helps to look at what Elvis's daily life actually looked like during the height of his fame. Graceland was never a quiet place. There were always people around, friends, family members, employees, and various associates who made up the group that the press called the Memphis Mafia. Elvis rarely went anywhere alone. He traveled with a group, ate with a group, and spent most of his waking hours surrounded by people whose lives were organized around his schedule and his needs. This kind of life has an effect on a person. When you are always at the center of a large group, when every decision you make affects the people around you, and when most of the people in your daily life are there because of what you represent rather than who you are, genuine conversation becomes harder to find. Elvis was a sociable person by nature. He liked people and enjoyed having company. But there is a difference between being surrounded by people and having someone to really talk to. Jerry Schilling was one of the people Elvis could really talk to. Several people who knew Elvis have noted over the years that he was more open with certain individuals than with others. Jerry fell into that smaller group, the people Elvis trusted with his actual thoughts rather than just his public face. Part of this came from the history between them. Jerry had known Elvis before the fame reached its full height, and that gave their conversations a foundation that newer relationships could not replicate. Part of it also came from the way Jerry carried himself. He was not someone who pushed Elvis for anything. He did not ask for favors, did not try to use the friendship to advance himself, and did not tell Elvis only what he wanted to hear. People close to Elvis have noted that honest voices around him became rarer as his career went on. The structure of life at Graceland made it difficult for people to disagree with him or raise concerns without risking their place in the group. Jerry, because he was building his own separate career and was not financially dependent on Elvis, could speak more freely. Elvis knew that, and it made Jerry's presence valuable in a specific way. Their conversations covered a wide range of ground over the years. Jerry has spoken in interviews about the kinds of things he and Elvis discussed: music, films, family, religion, and the pressures that came with living the life Elvis lived. Elvis had a genuine curiosity about ideas and spent a great deal of time reading about spirituality, philosophy, and the nature of human experience. Jerry was someone he could think out loud with, working through questions that did not have easy answers. The friendship also had a physical history to it. Jerry traveled with Elvis on tours, was present during film productions, and shared the kind of experiences that only come from spending real time with someone across many years and many different circumstances. They had seen each other in good moments and difficult ones. They had been through changes together. That kind of shared history creates a depth in a relationship that cannot be manufactured. What is also worth noting is that the friendship continued even during the periods when Jerry was not living at Graceland or traveling with Elvis. When Jerry moved to Los Angeles to pursue his own career in the film industry, the connection did not break. Elvis called him. They stayed in touch across the distance. This was not something Elvis did with everyone. The fact that he maintained that effort with Jerry says something about how much the friendship meant to him. By the 1970s, as Elvis's health began to decline and his world became more complicated, the people he reached out to privately became fewer. Jerry remained among them. He was one of the voices Elvis still wanted to hear, one of the people whose opinions still carried weight with him. This is the context that makes the final call between them so significant. It was not a random call from someone on the edges of Elvis's life. It was a call from a man who had spent over 20 years building something real with Jerry, a friendship based on trust, honesty, and genuine connection that outlasted most of what surrounded it. By the time 1977 arrived, Elvis Presley had been famous for more than 20 years. He had sold hundreds of millions of records, appeared in 33 films, and performed for audiences across the United States in arenas that were filled to capacity night after night.
On paper, his career was still active, and his name still drew enormous crowds. But behind that picture, the reality of Elvis's life in his final year was something that the people closest to him watched with growing concern. Elvis was 42 years old in 1977. That is not old by any normal measure, but the life he had lived had placed extraordinary demands on his body over many years. The touring schedule alone was relentless. His manager, Colonel Tom Parker, kept Elvis on the road for long stretches at a time, and the financial pressures that came with maintaining Graceland, supporting a large circle of employees and friends, and meeting various other obligations meant that stopping was not a simple option. Elvis toured because he needed to, and the pace of that touring through the mid-1970s was grueling for a man whose health was already under significant strain. His physical condition had changed visibly over the course of the 1970s. The lean young man who had appeared on television in the 1950s and the sharp, energetic performer of the 1968 comeback special had given way to someone who was clearly struggling. His weight had fluctuated considerably, and by 1977, he was heavier than he had been at any point in his career. He suffered from several serious health conditions, including an enlarged heart, liver damage, and glaucoma. He also had a long-standing dependence on prescription medications, a problem that had developed gradually over the years and had become a central part of his daily existence by the time he reached his final year. The medications Elvis took were prescribed by his personal physician, Dr. George Nicopolis, known to those around Elvis as Dr. Nick. The list of medications was extensive, covering everything from painkillers and sedatives to stimulants intended to keep him functional during performances. People inside the Graceland circle were aware that something was seriously wrong, but the situation was complicated. Elvis had enormous control over his own environment, and those who raised concerns risked being pushed away. The result was that a system had developed around him that kept him functioning enough to continue performing without addressing the root of the problem. His performances in 1977 reflected this reality. Some shows were strong, showing flashes of the talent and stage presence that had defined his career. Others were difficult to watch. There were concerts where Elvis forgot lyrics, moved slowly across the stage, and appeared disoriented. Bootleg recordings from this period circulate among fans and historians, and they paint an honest picture of a performer who was giving what he could while running on very little. Audiences who had paid to see Elvis were sometimes witnessing a man who was genuinely unwell, standing under the lights and trying to deliver. His personal life in 1977 was also in a difficult place. His marriage to Priscilla had ended in divorce in 1973, and though they maintained a civil relationship for the sake of their daughter Lisa Marie, that chapter of his life was closed. He had been in a relationship with Ginger Alden since late 1976, and she was present at Graceland in his final months. But the intimate world Elvis inhabited had grown smaller and more isolated. The people around him were largely the same group who had been there for years, and the routines inside Graceland had taken on a quality of repetition that left little room for anything new. Lisa Marie was 9 years old in 1977. Elvis's relationship with his daughter was one of the genuine sources of warmth in his life during this period. She visited Graceland, and those who were present have described how differently Elvis behaved around her, more relaxed, more present, more like the person he had been before the weight of everything else settled on him. But she was a child, and she could not carry the emotional burden that Elvis was living with. The people who spoke to Elvis privately during this period have described a man who was aware, on some level, that things were not right. He talked about the future in ways that were sometimes hopeful and sometimes uncertain. He made plans for recordings, for tours, for changes he wanted to make. Whether he believed those plans would happen is something only he knew. This was the world Elvis was living in when he picked up the phone and called Jerry Schilling for the last time. A world that had grown heavy, complicated, and narrow, and a man who still reached out to the people who had known him longest.
There are moments in a person's life that only become fully understood after the fact. At the time they happen, they seem like ordinary exchanges, a conversation, a goodbye, a few words spoken between two people who expect to speak again. It is only later, when circumstances change in ways that cannot be undone, that those moments take on a weight they did not carry when they were happening.
The final phone call between Elvis Presley and Jerry Schilling was one of those moments. The call took place in the summer of 1977 and the weeks before Elvis's death on August 16. Jerry was in Los Angeles at the time, living the life he had built for himself separate from Graceland. He was working in the music industry, managing artists, and moving through his own daily routine when the phone rang and Elvis was on the other end of the line. This was not unusual in itself. Elvis called Jerry periodically, and Jerry was accustomed to hearing from him. The calls did not always have a specific purpose. Sometimes Elvis wanted to talk about something particular, a project, a person, a situation he was thinking through. Other times he simply wanted to connect, to hear a familiar voice and have a conversation with someone he trusted. Jerry accepted both kinds of calls the same way, giving Elvis his full attention and engaging honestly with whatever came up. What Jerry has said publicly about this particular call is that it had a specific quality to it that he has returned to many times in the years since. Elvis was asking about Jerry's life, what he was working on, how things were going, whether he was doing well. This was characteristic of Elvis in conversations with people he genuinely cared about. He asked questions and listened to the answers. He was not someone who used every conversation to talk about himself, at least not with the people he was closest to. Jerry answered his questions and asked about Elvis in return. From what Jerry has shared, Elvis spoke about being tired. Not tired in a simple or passing way, but tired in a way that seemed to go deeper than the physical exhaustion that came from touring. He had been on the road, performing night after night, and the schedule had taken something out of him. But the tiredness Elvis described in that conversation seemed to be about more than the last few weeks or the last few shows. It carried the weight of years. Elvis also spoke about Graceland and the people there. He mentioned Lisa Marie. He talked about wanting things to be different, about changes he was thinking about making. Jerry has noted that there was a reflective quality to the conversation. Elvis was looking back at things as much as he was looking forward. That in itself was not entirely unusual for Elvis, who could be deeply thoughtful in private conversation. But the particular tone of that reflection has stayed with Jerry in the decades since. At some point during the call, Elvis told Jerry that he loved him. This was not out of character. Elvis was open with the people he cared about and did not hold back from expressing genuine affection. He had said similar things to Jerry before. But the way he said it in that final call, the directness of it, the simplicity, was something Jerry has mentioned when asked about the conversation. It was not a dramatic statement, it was just honest, the way Elvis could be when he was speaking to someone he fully trusted. The call ended the way most calls end, with an expectation of continuation. There was no indication on either side that this would be the last time they would speak. Jerry did not hang up the phone thinking he had just said goodbye to Elvis for the final time. He thought he had spoken to his friend and that he would hear from him again. That is the nature of these moments. They do not announce themselves. What is known is that Elvis made several phone calls in the days before his death, reaching out to various people in his life. Jerry was among them. The fact that Elvis spent some of his final days making those connections, calling the people who mattered to him, says something about where his mind was in that period. He was reaching outward toward the people he loved in a way that those who received those calls have thought about ever since. Jerry Schilling took that call in the summer of 1977, answered honestly, and said goodbye expecting to speak again. He did not get the chance.
There's a difference between listening to someone and truly hearing them. Most conversations happen on the surface. Two people exchanging words, responding to what is being said, moving through the interaction without going too deep beneath it. But occasionally, in a conversation with someone you have known for a long time, something comes through that is harder to name. A tone, a pause, a choice of words that does not quite match the ones they would normally use. Something that registers in the moment but does not fully announce itself until later, when you have reason to go back and think about what was actually being communicated. Jerry Schilling has spent decades thinking about his final phone call with Elvis. He's given interviews, written about their friendship, and spoken publicly about what that conversation meant to him. And one of the things that comes through consistently in what he's shared is that the call contained things he understood only after Elvis was gone.
Things that seemed like ordinary parts of a conversation at the time, but took on a different meaning once August 16, 1977 had passed. The tiredness Elvis expressed during that call was one of those things. Jerry has reflected on the fact that Elvis did not simply describe being worn out from touring. The way he spoke about it suggested something more accumulated, a weariness that had been building for a long time, and that went beyond what rest alone could fix. At the time, Jerry heard it as the honest admission of a man who had been pushing himself hard for too long. After Elvis died, he began to hear it differently. The tiredness Elvis described in that conversation was the tiredness of someone who had been carrying more than any single person should carry, for longer than most people could manage. There was also the reflective quality of the conversation that Jerry has pointed to in the years since. Elvis was looking back. He talked about people and experiences in a way that had a completeness to it. Not unfinished business, but more like someone taking stock. People who are planning their next chapter tend to talk about what is ahead. People who are, on some level, processing where they have been tend to look backward. Elvis, in that final call, was looking backward more than forward, and Jerry has acknowledged that this registered with him even at the time, though he did not fully understand what it might mean. The question of whether Elvis knew, consciously or otherwise, that he was approaching the end of his life is one that cannot be answered with certainty. What can be said is that people who are seriously ill sometimes communicate things in indirect ways, not through direct statements, but through the texture of their conversations, the things they choose to say, and the people they choose to say them to. Elvis was not in good health in the summer of 1977, and the people around him knew it, even if the full extent of his condition was not openly discussed. Jerry was not a doctor and was not present at Graceland to see Elvis's daily condition. He was receiving a phone call from a friend, engaging with what that friend was saying and responding as a friend would. But he was also someone who had known Elvis for over 20 years and who was familiar with the different registers of Elvis's voice and conversation. When something was different, he would have been among the people most likely to notice. What Jerry has expressed over the years is not that he knew during the call that Elvis was dying. He has been honest about the fact that he did not. What he has expressed is that after Elvis died, he went back to that conversation in his memory and found things in it that he had not fully processed at the time. The way Elvis said he loved him, the particular quality of the tiredness he described, the backward-looking tone of the reflection. Taken together, those elements told a story that was harder to see when he was in the middle of the conversation than it was to see afterward. This is one of the things that makes grief complicated for people who were close to someone who died suddenly. There's a period of going back through recent interactions, searching for what was said and what was not said, trying to understand whether there were signs that were missed. Jerry Schilling went through that process with a phone call that he has carried with him ever since. He heard his friend's voice. He listened to what Elvis said. And in the years that followed, he came to understand that Elvis had said more than either of them realized at the time. There are certain pieces of news that divide a life into two parts, before and after. The kind of news that arrives without warning and immediately changes the way you see everything that came before it. For Jerry Schilling, August 16, 1977 was that kind of day. It was the day he learned that Elvis Presley was gone. And it was the day the phone call he had recently shared with his friend took on a meaning it had not carried when it happened. August 16, 1977 began as an ordinary day for most people in the United States. It was a Tuesday in the middle of summer. People were going about their routines, unaware that by the afternoon, the news would carry a story that would stop conversations across the country and around the world. Elvis Presley had been found unresponsive at Graceland in Memphis, Tennessee. He was taken to Baptist Memorial Hospital, where doctors worked to revive him. At 3:30 in the afternoon, he was pronounced dead. He was 42 years old. The news spread the way major news spread in 1977, through radio broadcasts, television bulletins, and phone calls between people who had just heard and needed to tell someone else. There was no internet, no instant notification, no way for information to reach everyone simultaneously. People found out at different times and in different ways, and the reaction was the same almost everywhere. Disbelief, followed by the slow and painful process of accepting that it was true. Jerry Schilling was in Los Angeles when he received the news. He has spoken about those first moments, the shock that comes when something you were not prepared for arrives without any warning. Even when someone you care about has not been well, even when you have noticed things in recent conversations that gave you reason for concern, the actual moment of learning they are gone carries its own particular force. Nothing fully prepares a person for it. What happened in the hours after the news reached Jerry was a combination of personal grief and immediate practical response. Jerry was not just a friend of Elvis, he was someone with a long history inside the Graceland circle, someone who knew the family and the people closest to Elvis. When Elvis died, the world around Graceland became chaotic very quickly. There were decisions to be made, people to be contacted, and a situation of enormous complexity to be managed while everyone involved was also trying to process what had just happened. Jerry traveled to Memphis. He was among the people who came to Graceland in those first days to be with the family and to help with what needed to be done. Priscilla Presley was there. Vernon Presley, Elvis's father, was there. Lisa Marie, who was 9 years old and had been at Graceland when her father died, was there. The house that had always been full of activity took on a completely different quality in those days. The same rooms, the same spaces, but with the person who had defined all of it no longer present. The funeral took place on August 18th, 2 days after Elvis died. Thousands of fans gathered outside Graceland in the Memphis heat, paying their respects to a man whose music and presence had been part of their lives. Inside, the people who had known Elvis personally were saying goodbye in a more private way, looking at the face of someone they had eaten meals with, traveled with, laughed with, and argued with over many years. For Jerry, standing in those rooms and going through those days, the memory of the recent phone call was present in everything. That is the specific weight that falls on people who spoke to someone shortly before they died. The conversation that seemed ordinary at the time becomes the last one. Every word that was said takes on a finality it did not have when it was spoken. Jerry had told Elvis he loved him during that call, and Elvis had said the same back. That exchange, which was genuine and real when it happened, became the closing of something neither of them had known they were closing. The days at Graceland after Elvis died were filled with the kind of activity that surrounds any sudden death. Practical matters, press attention, the logistics of a situation that affected not just the family, but an entire industry and a worldwide audience. Jerry moved through all of it carrying what he was carrying privately, the way people do when they are grieving someone they are genuinely close to. He had spoken to Elvis just weeks before. He had heard his voice, heard him say he was tired, heard him say he loved him. And now, Elvis was gone, and that phone call was the last time Jerry Schilling would ever hear his friend speak. When someone you are close to dies, the grief does not follow a straight line. It does not arrive fully formed and then gradually decrease until it is gone. It moves differently than that, present in some moments and quieter in others, returning at unexpected times, changing shape as the years pass without ever fully disappearing. For Jerry Schilling, the loss of Elvis Presley in August 1977 was something he has carried through every decade that followed, and the memory of that final phone call has been part of what he has carried. Jerry was 35 years old when Elvis died. He had most of his adult life still ahead of him, and he lived it fully, building a career, maintaining relationships, and continuing to move through the world as his own person, rather than simply as someone who had been close to Elvis. But the friendship with Elvis was woven into who Jerry was, and its sudden end left a mark that did not fade with time the way smaller losses sometimes do. In the years immediately following Elvis's death, Jerry continued working in the music and entertainment industry. He had already established himself as a capable manager and industry professional before Elvis died, and that work continued. He managed artists, worked on various projects, and stayed connected to the broader world of music that had been part of his life since his teenage years in Memphis. The work gave him structure and purpose during a period when the grief was still close to the surface. He also stayed connected to the people who had shared the Graceland years with him. Priscilla Presley became one of the central figures in managing and protecting Elvis's legacy after his death, and Jerry remained part of that extended circle. The Elvis Presley estate became an organized and active institution over the decades, working to ensure that Elvis's music and image were handled responsibly and that his story was told accurately. Jerry was someone whose first-hand knowledge of Elvis made him a valued voice in those conversations. Over time, Jerry became one of the people journalists and documentarians turned to when they wanted an honest account of what Elvis had actually been like as a person. He gave interviews across the years, appearing in various documentaries and television programs that examined Elvis's life and legacy. What distinguished his contributions from some others was the consistency and thoughtfulness of what he shared. He did not sensationalize, he did not claim more than he knew. He spoke about Elvis the way someone speaks about a person they genuinely loved and genuinely knew, with care, with honesty, and with an awareness of the difference between the public image and the private reality. In 2006, Jerry published his memoir titled Me and a Guy Named Elvis. The book covers the full arc of his friendship with Elvis, from that first football game in Memphis in the 1950s through the decades that followed and up to the end. Writing the book required Jerry to go back through his memories systematically, to revisit not just the good times and the memorable moments, but also the harder parts, including the final year of Elvis's life and the phone call that has stayed with him. The process of writing about a friendship that ended with loss is not a simple one. It requires a person to sit with memories that carry both warmth and pain, to find language for things that happened decades ago but still feel present, and to share private experiences with a public audience in a way that is honest without being exploitative. Jerry approached that task with the same care he brought to his interviews. The book was received as a genuine and valuable account of what it was like to know Elvis as a human being, rather than as a celebrity. The final phone call appears in what Jerry has shared publicly as a specific point of reflection, a moment he returns to when thinking about Elvis and about what their friendship meant. He has not treated it as a dramatic centerpiece or used it to make claims he cannot support. He has simply acknowledged that the call stays with him, that it contains things he understands now that he did not fully understand at the time, and that it represents the closing of something that mattered deeply to him. More than 40 years after Elvis died, Jerry Schilling is in his 80s and still speaks about his friend with the kind of clarity and affection that only comes from a relationship that was real. The phone call is part of that story, not the whole of it, but a moment within it that carries particular weight. Some conversations end and are forgotten. Others stay with a person for the rest of their life. Jerry Schilling knows which kind that final call was. There is a version of Elvis Presley that most people know. The young man with the dark hair and the easy smile who appeared on television in the 1950s and changed the way popular music sounded. The performer in the white jumpsuit standing under the lights in Las Vegas, delivering songs to audiences who had waited years to see him in person. The faith on the posters, the voice on the records, the name that became synonymous with an entire era of American culture. That version of Elvis is real. It is documented, photographed, and preserved in ways that will outlast anyone who was alive to witness it firsthand. But there is another version of Elvis that is harder to see from the outside. The man who existed when the cameras were off and the audiences had gone home. The person who made phone calls late at night to the people he trusted, who asked questions about ideas he was working through, who said he was tired in a way that meant something deeper than physical exhaustion. The man who told his friends he loved them and meant it without any performance attached to the words. That version of Elvis is harder to document, but it is no less real, and it is the version that the story of his final phone call with Jerry Schilling brings into focus. What does that call tell us about who Elvis actually was? The first thing it tells us is that Elvis valued genuine human connection above almost everything else. He was one of the most famous people on earth for more than 2 decades, and fame of that magnitude creates a particular kind of isolation. The more well-known a person becomes, the harder it is for finding people who relate to them as a human being, rather than as a symbol or a source of something they want. Elvis navigated that reality for most of his adult life, And he did so by holding tightly to the relationships that existed before or outside of the fame. Jerry Schilling was one of those relationships, and the fact that Elvis was still calling him in the final weeks of his life, still wanting to hear his voice, still wanting to have an honest conversation, says everything about what Elvis understood to matter most. The second thing the call tells us is that Elvis was more self-aware than his public image sometimes suggested. The reflective quality that Jerry has described, the backward-looking tone, the acknowledgement of tiredness that went beyond the physical, points to a man who understood his own situation on some level. He may not have known he was weeks away from dying, but he was aware that things were not right, that the life he was living had costs, and that there were things he wished were different. That kind of self-awareness requires honesty with oneself that is not always easy to maintain when the world around you is organized to protect you from uncomfortable truths. The third thing it tells us is that Elvis loved the people in his life in a way that was direct and unguarded with the people he truly trusted. He told Jerry he loved them during that final call. He had said it before and would have said it again if the chance had come. For a man who spent so much of his life performing, giving audiences what they came to see, maintaining an image that the entire entertainment industry depended on, the moments when he dropped all of that and simply spoke from an honest place were significant. Jerry received one of those moments in their last conversation, and it has stayed with him because it was real in a way that performances, however brilliant, cannot be. The fourth thing the call tells us is something about the nature of Elvis's loneliness. Not loneliness in the simple sense of being alone. Elvis was rarely physically alone, but the kind of loneliness that comes from being known by everyone and truly understood by very few. The calls he made in his final weeks, reaching out to the people who had known him longest, suggest a man who was aware of that gap and who was trying, in the time he had, to close it a little bit. He was reaching toward the people who saw him clearly, the ones whose knowledge of him went back far enough to include the person he had been before the world decided what he was. Jerry Schilling was one of those people, and in that final phone call, Elvis reached toward him one last time, not as a star reaching out to a member of his circle, but as a man calling his friend. That is what the call tells us about Elvis Presley. Beneath everything else, the music, the films, the fame, the complicated final years, there was a person who needed what every person needs: to be known, to be loved, to hear a familiar voice on the other end of the line. He found that in Jerry Schilling, and Jerry Schilling has never forgotten it.